What if the assassination attempt on your pregnant wife was just a distraction? Dante just stopped a catastrophic system failure meant to kill his ex-wife in her hospital bed. But as the dust settles, his secured phone receives a single chilling message. She was never the target. The rival Russo family just pulled off the ultimate misdirection. If his unborn baby wasn't the target, who is?
Let's open the file on Dante Morti together, shall we? You and I have studied men like him before, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist. His boardroom was a physical manifestation of his pathology, dark walls built to swallow sound and isolate the men inside. Power, not comfort, was the only variable. Outside, the world was loud. Inside, a sterile vacuum controlled entirely by his ego. He sat at the head of the table, his silence functioning as a psychological weapon, forcing his captains into hyper-vigilant compliance. Narcissists of this magnitude rarely shout. They let ambient dread do the work for them. As an underling nervously recited dock territories, Dante simply traced his whiskey glass, exhibiting a chilling emotional detachment. We often see this clinical compartmentalization in high-functioning predators. 3 months prior, Dante dissolved his marriage to Elena with the same dead-eyed indifference he applied to cargo logistics. A single signature severing her from his orbit like a surgical amputation. He framed this abandonment as an administrative necessity, a defense mechanism to protect his superiority complex from the messy reality of human attachment. While his captain nervously outlined shipping routes, the carefully curated silence of Dante's psychological fortress was suddenly breached. A singular vibration from his cell phone cut through the heavy air. Every subordinate froze. It is truly fascinating how a simple mechanical buzz can completely shatter the illusion of absolute, unwavering control. In any rigid hierarchy, rule exceptions indicate a narcissistic extension of the leader. Only Marco was permitted to bypass the sensory blackout of this room. Notice Dante's behavioral response here. He did not immediately answer. Instead, he let the device vibrate again, maintaining a predatory stare on the speaking captain. This is a classic dominance display, forcing the subordinate to crumble under the weight of the interruption. Only when the captain stammered into total silence did Dante retrieve the device. There was no apology, no social softening. He lifted the phone with the terrifying mechanical precision of a man who believes he owns time itself. Yes, just one word. But on the other end, Marco hesitated. An abnormal disruption in their usual behavioral loop. You and I know that even the most impenetrable sociopathic masks have microscopic stress fractures. Marco's hesitation was the hammer, striking that exact weak point. When Marco finally spoke, his voice was gravely altered, prompting an involuntary muscle contraction in Dante's hand. "We found her." Those 3 words bypassed Dante's ironclad cognitive defenses, unearthing the psychological repression he buried beneath those divorce papers. His gaze physically detached from the room, entering a dissociative state. "Your ex-wife, she's pregnant." 4 months, at that precise data point, Dante experienced an acute autonomic nervous system freeze. The grandiose reality he had constructed simply stopped computing. He ceased breathing. 4 months. The math was an inescapable trauma trigger. That timeline stripped away his delusions of absolute autonomy. It forced him to confront the single night of vulnerable intimacy he had pathologized as a weakness. He had fled before dawn, deploying legal documents like a sterile tourniquet to stop the emotional bleeding. But then, Marco delivered the physiological variable. She's unconscious. Here is a simple truth we all must face eventually. You cannot outrun your own humanity, no matter how powerful your narcissism may be. no matter how deeply you bury it under cold logic. We see the exact moment Dante's internal architecture collapsed. To the untrained observers in the room, he merely stood up. But clinically, that abrupt, violent scrape of his chair against the floorboards was the sound of a megalomaniac finally losing his grip on his carefully curated universe. The paralysis in the room was absolute. Dante simply demanded the location, his brain instantly mapping the address to a high-risk sector. This geographic anomaly short-circuited his logic. He had arranged her financial safety, assuming money could cleanly sever their toxic codependency. What his rigid narcissism failed to calculate was the profound withdrawal Elena would suffer. We frequently observe this in victims bearing the marks of Stockholm Syndrome. When abruptly exiled from a dominant captor, they often spiral into highly dangerous environments, subconsciously chasing the chaotic familiarity of fear. Why was she unprotected? Why unconscious? His omnipotent self-image was violently fracturing under these unknowns. "Boss," Marco pressed, his tone spiking with a rare, desperate panic. "We need to move." Dante terminated the connection, severing the data feed. "Watch him closely here. As you and I analyze this critical behavioral shift together." He reached for his jacket with his usual mechanical precision, but his micro-expressions betrayed a massive internal hemorrhage of panic. The locked jaw, the rigid elevation of his shoulders, the godlike mask was finally slipping. Meetings over. No delegation, no contingency plans. This is the precise moment the detached kingpin dissolved into a desperate primal state. When a senior captain foolishly asked about the dock operations, Dante's "handle it" wasn't a directive. It was a lethal, unspoken threat. He exited the room, radiating a violent heat driven entirely by an obsessive psychological need to reclaim what was his. Let's unpack this case file together, starting with Dante. Notice his movement through the corridor. Guards straighten instinctively. He demands absolute environmental control. But inside that slow elevator, his psychological armor finally fractures. He is flooded with memories of Elena leaving 4 months ago with a single suitcase. She turned back, waiting for him to stop her. He didn't. He reframed this brutal discard as protection, convincing himself love was just a tactical liability. We see this often in antisocial profiles. They disguise emotional cowardice as logic. The lesson here is stark. We tell ourselves noble lies to avoid our own fears. Out in the cold air, the city feels irrelevant to a man losing his grip. The external world still caters to him. His enforcer, Marco, has the car waiting. Dante slides into the back, the heavy door sealing him inside his own echo chamber. The engine roars, tires biting the pavement, but Dante is entirely dissociated from the present moment. He isn't registering the city outside the glass. His mind is fixated on the image of Elena lying unconscious in the dark, carrying his unborn child. For a megalomaniac, there is nothing more terrifying than powerlessness. For the first time in years, Dante Morti experiences genuine, paralyzing fear. It gnaws at him quietly beneath the skin, sharp and completely unforgiving. Meanwhile, across the city, Elena Rossi had already felt the teeth of that exact same fear long before her physical body finally collapsed. Let's examine Elena's physical and mental collapse. Her knees hit the concrete hard, sending a sharp shock up her spine. Notice how the urban environment reacts. It doesn't. Headlights slice the dark, and pedestrians pass her by as if she is merely debris. This profound isolation accelerates trauma. Even as her nervous system shuts down, her maternal instinct takes over. She presses a trembling hand to her abdomen, trying to shield the only thing she has left from a world that systematically stripped her of everything else. For months, she has clung to a quiet, fragile promise, deeply terrified of breaking it. She never intended for her reality to unravel this way. The tragic reality of human nature is that our lives rarely ask for our permission before they completely fall apart. She is suffering from profound cognitive dissonance. Intrusive memories of Dante's penthouse haunt her in disjointed flashes, the cold marble floors, the absolute silence of excessive wealth, the lingering scent of his expensive cologne. She had fully internalized that controlled environment as a permanent safety net. Her quiet certainty in that life now registers to her as pure naivete. When the discard happened, it wasn't a mutual separation. It was a unilateral termination. The divorce came like a surgical blade, cold and absolute. Papers were delivered without context. Signatures were extracted without a single conversation. We must remember, placing your entire sense of security in someone else's hands is a dangerous gamble. He dismantled her entire existence in mere hours. You and I have seen this pattern before. She stood there holding the envelope, her identity abruptly erased, waiting for a lifeline that would never come. She compulsively dialed the numbers she knew by heart, his office, his phone. Every time she hit a deliberate wall of silence, turned away by men instructed to erase her from his world. Victims typically misinterpret this initial stonewalling as mere anger or pride. By the time the suffocating reality of her total discard set in, it was too late. The financial settlement barely lasted a month. Rent devoured almost everything, leaving absolute scraps for food and transport. Her psychological trauma was immediately compounded by a desperate fight for physical survival. It shows how quickly luxury can evaporate into pure desperation. Let's observe her adaptive behaviors. She began liquidating assets, jewelry first, then her clothing. From a clinical perspective, every transaction was a painful shedding of the persona he had constructed for her. But the core injury here is not the loss of material wealth. It is the absolute destruction of her baseline safety. That illusion shattered when she accepted she was completely alone, carrying an unplanned child she still refused to regret. Her body began keeping the score. The dizzy spells started weeks ago, mild at first. She rationalized them as simple stress and exhaustion from running on fumes. The human mind is incredibly adept at ignoring physical warning signs when it is singularly focused on the daily arithmetic of staying alive. This brings us to the final stage of her environmental degradation. Working punishing shifts at a diner, her manager viewed her physical reality entirely as a liability, calling her a weak link. Her shifts were cut, her income vanished. Food suddenly became an optional commodity, strictly rationed. She suppressed her own basic biological needs in a desperate attempt to nourish the fetus. She needed to be a mother, not a mathematician constantly calculating her own survival. It is a tragic inversion of the protection Dante claimed to offer. When powerful men manipulate people like chess pieces, it is always the vulnerable who are left starving in the dark. It is a grim reminder that true strength is found in how we care for others, not in how ruthlessly we can discard them. As clinicians, you and I know the brain begins to misfire under extreme caloric deficit. Let us examine the subject, Elena. She was driven to the edge of biological collapse. Having consumed nothing but a discarded, stale half sandwich in 24 hours, her spatial awareness rapidly deteriorated. The street lamps morphed into elongated, distorted yellow streaks. Observe how she reached for the cold metal of a park bench, failing to secure a grip as her fine motor skills abandoned her. She collapsed. The impact with the concrete felt entirely detached to her, a classic dissociative response to physical trauma. The chaotic noise of the city faded into an indistinct, distant drone, leaving her with only the shallow, erratic rhythm of her own failing respiration. Every inhalation became a desperate biological negotiation. At this critical juncture of systemic failure, her mind retreated to the architect of her trauma. She did not picture the cold, detached narcissist who abandoned her, but the idealized phantom from their initial courtship. This is a textbook manifestation of trauma bonding, clinging to a distorted image of her captor to survive. His name escaped her lips, Dante. It was a mere breath, heavy with repressed psychological agony. Her hand instinctively shielded her abdomen. "I'm trying," she whispered into the void. It remains clinically ambiguous whether she addressed the megalomaniac who broke her or the unborn biological life currently dependent upon her failing system. "I'm really trying." Her words fractured as her central nervous system yielded to the profound exhaustion she had suppressed for weeks. The cold penetrated her compromised defenses, enveloping her unmoving form as her visual cortex completely shut down. Yet, before total unconsciousness, a faint biological flutter against her palm served as a fragile tether to reality. She was carrying another life. "Now, I want you to look closely." As the predator enters the environment, a vehicle turned onto the desolate street, maintaining a calculated, aggressive velocity. Its headlights dissected the darkness, illuminating fractured concrete and derelict storefronts. The vehicle did not decelerate. It sliced through the urban decay, projecting an aura of total dominance over the physical space. Inside the confined space of the vehicle, the subject known as Dante maintained total silence. He did not need vocalization to establish control. The psychological pressure he exerted was suffocating, wrapping around his subordinates like an unspoken threat. Marco, the operative in the front seat, exhibited visible signs of autonomic stress, his jaw rigid, scanning the shadows. Up ahead, Marco finally reported, left side near the bus stop. His tone was meticulously regulated, fearful that a sudden acoustic spike might trigger his employer's volatile pathology. The vehicle initiated a controlled stop, but Dante was already kinetic. He breached the door with a violent, decisive motion that shattered the ambient silence of the street like a ballistic discharge. The frigid atmosphere struck him, yet his sensory processing ignored the temperature entirely. His focus narrowed into a singular obsessive fixation on the collapsed form. You and I must recognize the cognitive dissonance occurring within his brain here. For a fraction of a second, his megalomaniacal mind actively rejected the visual data. He attempted to reconstruct reality to fit the narrative he had fabricated over the past 3 months. In his delusion, she was perfectly preserved, shielded by the intricate surveillance apparatus he controlled. That logic disintegrated the moment he reached her. "Elena," he vocalized. The sound was uncharacteristically fragile, stripping away the terrifying facade of the criminal kingpin. She remained entirely unresponsive to his physical presence. The subject lay in a fetal defensive posture on the concrete, her hand locked over her abdomen. Even in a state of severe neurological shutdown, the primal instinct to protect the fetus persisted. Dante dropped to his knees, utterly disregarding the contamination of his garments against the debris. For a narcissist obsessed with immaculate presentation, this behavioral deviation is highly significant. Nothing registered in his consciousness except the dangerously shallow respiration and the abnormal pallor of her skin under the harsh streetlights. Christo, he exhaled. The syllable carried an absolute suspension of disbelief bordering on genuine biological panic. His hand hesitated before making contact with her facial tissue. The tactile feedback was immediate and alarming. She was freezing. This hypothermic state was not merely environmental. It was the physiological manifestation of prolonged neglect, the degradation of an organism's deprived of essential survival requirements. Dante's fingers operated on pure instinct, clearing the hair from her face to reveal the severe skeletal depression beneath her cheekbones. This physical decay violently contradicted the pristine, idealized mental construct he had maintained of her since his departure. "Boss," Marco cautioned from a safe distance behind him, his vocal cadence carefully modulated. "We need to move. She's been out here too long." Dante exhibited delayed auditory processing. His visual cortex was locked onto the subtle, previously obscured curvature beneath Elena's oversized clothing, an anatomical change he had completely missed. That visual cue instantly reconfigured his entire psychological framework. 4 months. The timeline was no longer a sterile concept, but a biological reality throbbing beneath his palm against her abdomen. Here was a living organism carrying his genetic sequence, existing outside his sphere of control. For a megalomaniac, any lack of operational awareness is a profound existential threat. The musculature in his jaw, locked as a highly volatile impulse, began to surface. "How long?" he demanded. "I want you to carefully analyze the shift in his vocal frequency here." It dropped into a lethal register that forced his subordinate to brace for immediate violence. "How long has she been like this?" Marco faltered for a mere fraction of a second. "We don't know exactly. We got the call from one of the watchers 10 minutes ago," Marco reported. He said she collapsed suddenly. There was hesitation in reporting the incident. At that specific trigger word, Dante's posture snapped upright. His focus locked onto Marco with a predatory intensity that bordered on physical assault. Hesitation. That single word carried the lethal weight of an execution order. Marco exhaled, attempting to regulate his own nervous system. The orders were unclear. They were told to observe, not intervene unless there was a direct threat. A dense, suffocating silence expanded into the cold air. Dante redirected his gaze to Elena, the victim he had isolated under the delusion of ensuring her absolute safety. The empirical data across the concrete dismantled his grand rationalizations. Separation had not functioned as a shield. His absence had engineered a catastrophic vulnerability. His grip on her fingers compressed, an instinctual need to anchor himself to reality as his illusions of omnipotence fractured. "Get the car ready," he commanded, his tone devoid of negotiation. "We're not taking her to a hospital." Marco confirmed the protocol already arranged. "Private facility, no records, no questions." "Good." Dante slid his arms beneath her skeletal frame, elevating her with a chilling, calculated precision. Her body mass was deeply alarming, presenting a clear metric of profound, sustained physical deterioration. That precise metric of decay lodged in his chest cavity like dense iron. As he stood, her skull listed against his clavicle. The faint expulsion of her breath against his skin was the only biological confirmation that she had not yet expired. "Stay with me," he instructed in a near imperceptible whisper. "You don't get to disappear like this." He transported her toward the vehicle with terrifying, robotic symmetry. Yet, beneath that exterior, a massive psychological destabilization was actively occurring. The rigid barriers he utilized to compartmentalize his emotions were dissolving. Marco anticipated the trajectory, securing the vehicle door. Dante occupied the rear cabin, meticulously arranging her inert form against his own torso to preserve her plummeting core temperature. His hand instinctively sought her abdomen, drawn to the hidden biological variable he had completely failed to monitor. The heavy door sealed them inside an acoustic vacuum, a space suddenly compressed by his overwhelming psychological density. "Drive," he ordered. The tires aggressively engaged the asphalt, rapidly increasing velocity. Dante maintained a rigid downward fixation on Elena's facial structure. He clinically catalogued every sunken contour, quantifying exactly how much life had been extracted from her in his absence. His thumb palpated the radial artery in her wrist. The cardiac rhythm was erratic, depressed, but functionally present. For a healthy mind, this would induce relief. But within a megalomaniac, an entirely different, malignant pathology was actively taking root. What grew within him was infinitely more destructive than organic human fear. It was the cold calculus of retaliation. Every passing second fused into an intolerable reality. Another entity had permitted this degradation. Another variable had allowed his prime obsession to face biological termination without his knowledge. Here is a profound truth you and I must remember. True love requires relinquishing control, because treating another human being as a possession ultimately destroys the very soul you claim to cherish. Dante lacked this capacity. He shifted his gaze to the glass. His reflection was a mask of pure malice. "Marco," he instructed, his voice entirely devoid of baseline human emotion, "find out who was responsible for watching her. Today, you and I are going to unpack a classic presentation of the megalomaniac narcissist under threat." Notice how Dante reacts to the withheld truth. His hand tightens on Elena, not out of affection, but possession. She is his object. "Don't bring me excuses," he tells his subordinate, Marco, his voice dropping into that cold, final register typical of antisocial personalities. The car speeds toward an unmapped, covert clinic, a physical manifestation of his need to operate outside societal law. For the first time, Dante processes this event not as a systemic error, but as a direct betrayal. To a narcissist of his caliber, an oversight is an insult, a betrayal is an act of war. The interior of the clinic mirrors the architecture of a psychopath's mind, spotless, silent, utterly stripped of humanity. Every surface is designed for absolute control, operating efficiently and entirely without public record. The gates open in anticipation, reinforcing Dante's delusion of omnipotence. Stepping from the vehicle, he doesn't even glance at the building. His focus remains entirely on Elena, clutching her tighter against his chest. When the medic team rushes forward, he barks for her vitals before they can even speak. The lead doctor replies that she is unstable, gesturing for a gurney. Dante ignores the protocol. He retains physical custody of the victim, dictating the terms of her survival. Observe his hesitation. Dante locks eyes with the lead physician, clinically calculating if this man is competent enough to handle his property. The doctor reports severe dehydration and malnutrition, choosing his words carefully to avoid triggering a violent outburst. Only then does Dante surrender her to the gurney. But watch the physical mechanics. His hands linger on her skin, a fraction of a second too long. In behavioral profiling, we see this constantly with captors. Releasing the victim, even to save her life, creates acute psychological friction. He follows the gurney down the corridor immediately. His sheer pathological dominance forces the staff to step aside instinctively, parting like water before a predator. The sterile hum of machinery takes over, a fragile rhythm of controlled life. They wire her to monitors, exposing the physiological truth her trauma bond had previously masked. Dante positions himself at the foot of the bed, a dominant stance, processing the flickering numbers not with empathy, but as a ledger of damages to his assets. Her pulse is dangerously weak, her skin unnaturally cold. Then comes the critical variable. The doctor notes she is 4 months pregnant. Dante confirms it instantly, his voice entirely devoid of normal human anxiety. To a megalomaniac, an unborn child isn't merely a life, it is an extension of the self, a biological monument to his own legacy. There is zero room for uncertainty. His brain has already mapped the timeline with ruthless, sociopathic clarity. The previous night, the sudden silence, the failed attempts at permanent separation. The doctor states they must run immediate scans, openly citing the high medical risks of her physical condition. Dante closes the physical distance, his gaze locked rigidly on Alina's face. "You save both," he states quietly. It sounds simple, but in the clinical sense, this is a direct, coercive threat. He is removing their agency, turning a medical procedure into an absolute mandate, whatever it takes. Nobody in that room dares to contradict him. The staff falls into a state of highly controlled panic, adjusting intravenous lines while hyper-aware of the predator standing just feet away. Notice his body language here. Dante doesn't sit down. He stands perfectly still, rigid as stone, cataloging every single detail. I mean, his brain is processing this entirely through the framework of control rather than medical concern. Marco enters the room with heavily measured movements, whispering that the perimeter is secure and unseen. Dante delays his response, a classic dominance tactic, before finally shifting his gaze. He asks about the watcher. Marco hesitates, a microscopic delay indicating fear. He reports the man is being questioned. Dante states calmly that he will conduct the interrogation himself. A subtle tightening of his jaw is the only physical leak of his escalating internal rage. That small jaw movement carries immense psychological weight. He tells Marco that he should already know if the captive is lying. Marco briefly breaks eye contact, citing a verbal inconsistency. In Dante's rigid cognitive structure, an inconsistency is a direct challenge to his constructed reality. He looks back at Alina, staring at the monitors, tracking her fragile survival. Marco carefully explains that the watcher claims he was following protocol, instructed to observe, not intervene unless facing a direct external threat. Dante's gaze sharpens violently. The watcher didn't classify her gradual starvation as a threat. In the heavy silence, Dante touches Alina's wrist, physically verifying the pulse of his damaged possession. Her pulse is there, but fading. Dante states very softly that those were not his orders. His vocal pitch drops, signaling a shift from reactive anger to predatory calculation. Listen to his exact phrasing. "I don't leave what's mine unprotected." Total objectification. She is not a person, she is a prized possession. Marco remains silent, fully conditioned to accept this twisted reality. The lead doctor returns, visibly suppressing his own anxiety, explaining that they have achieved temporary stability despite severe malnutrition. He cuts himself off before detailing the grim alternative, recognizing the danger of speaking too freely. Dante's flat effect cracks, just enough to reveal a cold, mechanical focus. He simply demands an update on the baby. The physician confirms a fetal heartbeat, noting that both mother and child remain highly fragile. Fragility is a concept an extreme narcissist actively rejects. Dante steps toward the bed, hand hovering near her, but stopping short of contact. He issues a quiet, absolute directive. Fix it. When the doctor offers the standard medical reassurance that they will do everything possible, Dante's pathology flares. He locks eyes with the man, stripping away any professional boundaries. "That's not what I said," he corrects, demanding absolute compliance. He expects medicine to bend to his sheer willpower. As the terrified doctor nods, Dante studies the physical degradation on Alina's body, calculating the cost of a variable he failed to control. Let's pause here, you and I, to look at how a mind like his processes failure. Dante traces the failure through his rigid systems, the layers of security he placed between her and the outside world. He concludes that the breakdown was not an oversight, but a deliberate act. As the realization sets in, his paranoia solidifies into absolute certainty. This was active interference. Someone dared to alter his rules and decide his possession held no value. Look at his hands. His fingers curl slowly against the metal bed frame. A lesser criminal would erupt, shouting and breaking things, but his reaction is far more severe. He bypasses temporary, loud rage entirely, settling into a state of hyper-focused, homicidal ideation. What replaces his anger is cold, precise, and entirely permanent. He doesn't even look away from Alina as he orders Marco to identify who altered the directive. Dropping his voice to a whisper, he commands Marco not to bring the traitor to him immediately. Marco assumes this delay is about confirming the intelligence. Instead, Dante finally allows his hand to rest against Alina's fingers, brushing her skin to ground his fractured ego in the physical reality of his possession. He wants to know exactly how deep the infection in his organization runs before he begins excising it. The medical monitors beep in a steady, detached rhythm, measuring the physical toll of this psychological warfare in fragile, terrifying increments. Dante remains frozen by the bed, his pathological obsession refusing to let her slip away a second time. A violent internal war has already commenced behind his eyes. Meanwhile, we observe Alina's consciousness resurfacing. In victims of severe trauma, awareness rarely returns smoothly. It shatters into fragments. She registers the mechanical beeping, first distant, before crashing loudly into her sensory cortex. Then she processes the physical shift. The warmth of a medical bed replacing the freezing pavement, the sterile softness of hospital fabric against her skin. The air is heavily filtered, smelling of sharp antiseptic, yet layered with an undercurrent of something much darker. A familiar scent that her traumatized brain struggles to decode. She attempts a physical response, but her motor functions resist, a classic somatic symptom of profound exhaustion. A low groan escapes her throat, instantly accelerating the heart monitor and betraying her wakefulness. Heavy, controlled footsteps cross the room instantly. Easy. That single word cuts through her neurological fog. It is his voice. Low, steady, absolute. Notice her autonomic reaction here. Her breath catches entirely before her eyelids even flutter. She experiences a dissociative moment, assuming this is merely a hallucination. The mind, suffering from profound Stockholm syndrome, frequently plays these cruel tricks, projecting the voice of the captor into empty rooms, replaying the very source of their terror as a twisted form of false comfort. Let us open this file together, you and I. The subject, Alina, regains consciousness. Notice the weight in the room, a suffocating presence that does not vanish when she blinks. Her eyelids flutter against the harsh light, slowly registering the clinical lines of an unfamiliar space. Then she sees him, Dante, the classic megalomaniac narcissist. He stands near the bed, jaw rigid, eyes shadowed by an unsettling fatigue. He watches her not with relief, but with the terrifying focus of a predator confirming possession of a misplaced artifact. An agonizing silence stretches out. "You should not be here," she whispers. Her voice is fractured, devoid of anger, echoing only the profound disbelief of a captive confronting her captor. Dante's response remains unnervingly controlled, masking a dangerous psychological volatility beneath simple words. Instinctively, Elena's hand drops to her abdomen. It is a primal, biological defense mechanism, anchoring her shattered psyche to the reality of the child within. Her throat constricts. "How long?" she asks. "4 months," Dante replies. No hesitation, no margin for error. Observe his pathology. He operates entirely without doubt. Through her severe exhaustion, a flicker of awareness returns. "You are certain," she murmurs. "I do not deal in uncertainty," he states. This is the very core of his disorder. Everything in his orbit must be sterile, calculated, and absolutely managed. He dictates reality, leaving no room for the unpredictable variables of human emotion. Even the termination of their marriage adhered to his clinical methodology. There was no closure, merely a unilateral severing. To him, she was an object to be removed from his controlled environment without lingering consequences. Her lips part, yielding a fragile accusation born of classic Stockholm syndrome. She still yearns for the monster who discarded her. "Then you should have known," she breathes. A microscopic shift in Dante's posture betrays the immense effort required to maintain his facade. "I should have," he concedes. 3 brief words, yet they carry an oppressive psychological gravity. Elena exhales a slow, shuddering breath, the room tilting as the trauma resurfaces. "I tried to tell you," she says, the memory of her frantic attempts clawing its way back. She catalogues her desperate attempts to regain her captor's attention. "I called your office," she explains. "I went to the restaurant. I sent emails. I even waited outside your building like—" She halts, dismissing her own humiliation. "It does not matter." His voice cuts through her cognitive fog, sharp and commanding. "It matters." Her eyes narrow, fighting the psychological pull he exerts over her. "Does it? Because from my perspective, your decision was absolute." Dante encroaches on her physical space, weaponizing his proximity until the air grows desperately thin. "I gave orders," he states. His tone drops into a controlled, lethal register, specific ones. "You were supposed to be taken care of, protected, provided for." A hollow, broken laugh escapes her pale lips. "Protected," she repeats, the word tasting like ash. "I have been surviving in a single room with broken heating and a severe infestation. I work double shifts simply to exist. I have not eaten a proper meal in days." Her protective grip on her abdomen tightens, highlighting the severe neglect. That is your version of protection. In this precise moment, we witness a profound rupture in Dante's psychological framework. It is not mere anger. It is the violent realization that his omnipotent control has been breached. "That is not what I ordered," he mutters, almost to himself. Elena watches him, a freezing detachment settling over her. "Then perhaps your commands hold far less power than you believe," she replies. The resulting silence is suffocating. Dante turns away, breaking eye contact for the first time. His hand sweeps across his mouth in a slow, highly deliberate motion. We are watching a supreme narcissist rapidly recalculating his reality. Someone altered his design. Someone dared to interfere. Suddenly, the chaotic variables align into a sinister logic. When he faces her again, all trace of vulnerability is eradicated, replaced by a terrifying, cold clarity. "Who stopped you?" he asks softly. The inquiry is heavy with impending violence. Elena squints through her mental haze, struggling to retrieve the memory. "A man from security, with a scar on his cheek," she recalls, her vocal cords tightening. He told me you would file a restraining order if I ever returned. The atmosphere in the room instantly turns to ice. Dante remains perfectly still, yet the darkness flooding his eyes triggers a primal fear response in Alina. Did he? She asks, her voice trembling with sudden uncertainty, the trauma bond fracturing under new evidence. Did you tell him that? His denial is instantaneous. No, one single, absolute word. In that split second, the foundation of her perceived reality crumbles. Her mind scrambles to process this cognitive dissonance. Then why? She pleads. Because someone wanted you entirely severed, Dante replies. His voice plummets to a terrifying sub-zero frequency, isolated and invisible. Her hand flinches toward her stomach again, a raw maternal instinct. Why? She asks again. Dante tracks the movement, a lethal predator surfacing from his deepest psychological depths. Because you are carrying something they cannot afford to let exist, he states. The declaration settles into the sterile air, heavy and inescapable. This is no longer merely a fractured domestic bond. It has escalated into a complex threat against a narcissist's legacy. Whatever psychological damage existed between them is eclipsed by the impending retaliation. Let us shift our focus to the aftermath, shall we? At the edge of the river sits a decaying warehouse, an architectural corpse blending into the surrounding ruin. Inside, the environment is engineered for terror. Stark, white light slashes across the cold concrete, casting long shadows into corners where the silence is palpably dense. The atmosphere reeks of oil, rust, and the metallic tang of human panic. Dante breaches the threshold without a fraction of hesitation. Notice how a true sociopath alters the molecular weight of a room simply by entering. Every subordinate instantly stiffens, their bodies reacting to the apex predator in their midst. In the center of this brutal theater sits Tommaso, secured to a bolted metal chair. His chin rests against his chest, a trail of dried blood painting his jawline. He is battered, his breathing jagged and irregular, yet he remains entirely conscious. This deliberate, calculated application of pain is fascinating. The physical trauma was precisely measured, enough to shatter his psychological defenses, but not enough to render him useless. Dante does not engage in mindless violence. He requires the victim's cognitive functions intact. Marco stands nearby, sleeves rolled up over bruised knuckles. His face is the blank mask of professional detachment as he acknowledges his employer. He is being cooperative, Marco reports, though the phrasing feels entirely hollow, amended quickly by, to a point. Dante offers no verbal response. He advances with a slow, hypnotic deliberation, halting only when he is inches from the captive. For an agonizing duration, Dante says absolutely nothing. He weaponizes the silence, allowing the psychological pressure to compound until it threatens to crush the man's sanity. Under this immense weight, Tommaso begins to unravel. His shoulders seize. His respiration accelerates into a panic, and he forces his heavy head upward to meet the dark, unblinking gaze of his executioner. Their eyes connect, and you can almost hear the last fragments of Tommaso's mental fortitude snapping. Boss, his voice shatters, leaking pure terror. I can explain. Dante tilts his head slightly. It is the clinical curiosity of a scientist examining a defective specimen, deciding whether to dissect it or burn it. Explain what? Dante asks, his tone dangerously soft. How my former wife ended up starving in a district where I do not even permit my enemies to tread. Or perhaps how my unborn heir was abandoned without the protection I explicitly mandated. Tommaso swallows a lump of pure fear, his eyes darting toward Marco before snapping back to his master. That was not how it was supposed to unfold, he stammers, his syllables colliding in a desperate bid for survival. The instructions I received, they were altered. Tommaso pleads. Dante's gaze narrows, a microscopic shift that signals lethal intent. Altered how? I was commanded to sever all her ties, Tommaso confesses, his words spilling out as the panic fully takes root. Total isolation, no financial backing beyond the preliminary settlement. I was informed she needed to be erased from your existence, that it was your absolute will. A low, synthetic sound vibrates in Dante's chest, a laugh utterly devoid of mirth or humanity. And you accepted that narrative. Tommaso hesitates for a fraction of a second, sealing his fate. Yes, he admits weakly. You wanted her gone. The separation was clean. It was logical. Dante steps into his personal space, turning the air into a vice. You are not compensated for your cognitive deductions, Dante whispers. You are compensated for executing my directives with flawless precision. Tommaso gasps for air. I did. No, Dante interjects, slicing through the room like a scalpel. You obeyed someone else. A dense quiet reclaims the space. You and I have likely witnessed this defense mechanism before. Beneath his terror lies a frantic evasion. It is this exact deception that turns Dante's demeanor entirely glacial. Who issued the command? Dante demands. Tommaso shakes his head. No one. You assumed incorrectly. Dante grips his jaw. There is a simple truth here. Blindly trusting the system without verifying the source is the fastest way to orchestrate your own destruction. Let's examine the pathology of control here. Dante spoke softly, yet his voice carried the lethal weight of a true megalomaniac. You let her starve, he stated. Referring to Alina and the unborn child he felt ultimate ownership over. Tommaso strained against his restraints, pleading ignorance, claiming the orders came from higher up. But narcissists like Dante do not accept mitigating factors. To them, failure is betrayal. Tommaso's psychological defenses shattered completely. A typical response when prey realizes the predator cannot be reasoned with. You and I know all too well that in life, when we delegate our moral compass to others, we are the ones left to pay the ultimate price. Dante's grip tightened, an assertion of absolute, terrifying dominance. Higher than me? Dante asked. Notice the clinical fascination in his tone. For a megalomaniac, the very concept of a higher authority is genuinely amusing. Tommaso hesitated, and in that split second of silence, Dante extracted his answer. When Tommaso finally broke, his spirit entirely drained, and he confessed the funds came from external, encrypted channels tied to the Russo family. The Russo name hung in the damp air, acting as a profound psychological trigger. Marco, the enforcer, visibly tensed, displaying the primal fight-or-flight response of a loyal soldier. Yet Dante remained perfectly motionless. It is a haunting truth of human behavior that the most dangerous individuals do not explode in rage. They go entirely still, calculating their next strike. To Dante, the involvement of the Russo organization was not a mere business dispute. It was an intimate violation. His mind, highly systemized and devoid of ordinary empathy, rapidly connected the data points. The altered directives, the financial starvation, the severed communications. It was a deliberate psychological operation. They sought to isolate Alina, to strip away her support structures, until she developed a profound dependency, an engineered vulnerability. We often forget, but true power is not shown through loud declarations. It is found in quiet, systematic dismantling. Dante realized they did not just want to physically eliminate her. They wanted to expose his singular weakness. They didn't just want her gone, he murmured, speaking only to his own calculating mind. Marco offered a grim nod, fully processing the tactical reality. A solitary, unprotected woman is the textbook definition of an easy target. Dante's focus, however, immediately shifted to the unborn child, an extension of his own ego, a legacy threatened before it could draw breath. Tomas, trapped in a desperate bid for survival, pleaded that he never intended for things to escalate this far. He thought it was merely an operation to keep Alina at a distance. But Dante looked at him, and all traces of humanity had vanished from his eyes. There was no rage, only the clinical detachment of an executioner. "You do not need to know," Dante whispered. "It is a sobering lesson for us all. Ignorance of the harm we participate in never absolves us of its consequences." Tommaso froze, his cognitive dissonance dissolved, leaving only the primal realization of his impending end. Everyone in that cold room understood the diagnosis. Dante simply turned his back, his mind already detached from the dying man and focused entirely on the territorial violation he had suffered. Someone had touched what he considered his property. When Marco carefully asked for final instructions regarding the prisoner, Dante did not even break his stride. "Make it known," he commanded, his voice as indifferent as a surgeon making an incision, "that this is what happens when someone interferes with my family." The heavy door swung open, welcoming the freezing night air. It reminds us that cruelty is rarely born of passion. It is most often born of cold, unyielding pride. And Marco, Dante added, allowing a deliberate pause for the psychological weight to settle, "this is not over." What began as a perceived oversight had mutated into total war. We must look at how the environment shifted to reflect his psyche. The hospital was no longer a sanctuary of healing. It had been transformed into a paranoid fortress, locked down by men operating entirely outside the boundaries of the law. Dante stood rigid behind the sterile glass of the intensive care unit. Inside, Alina lay tethered to life support, a fragile subject trapped in a web of clinical machinery. She appeared diminished to him, stripped of her autonomy. It is a tragic truth that we often only recognize the vital presence of a loved one when they are reduced to an absence of themselves. I want you to carefully observe Dante in this moment. The quiet defiance Alina once radiated, even while navigating rooms full of apex predators, was entirely gone. She was painfully pale, hovering in the liminal space between existence and nothingness. For the first time, Dante experienced a crack in his rigid armor, an intrusive emotion threatening his absolute control. A classic narcissist simply cannot process grief, so he converts it into a profound need for retaliation. The relentless beep of the heart monitor was the only anchor to reality. She was fighting, and beneath that, another fragile life was fighting, too. The lesson here is profound. Life persists, even in the darkest, most controlled environments. The sheer will to survive is a force that defies all logical calculation. A micro-expression of tension flickered across Dante's jaw. His analytical mind was violently reviewing his past decisions. He had executed the divorce papers with surgical precision, convinced that severing Alina from his life would shield her from his chaotic underworld. It is a common delusion among powerful men, the belief that their absence equates to safety. Instead, his abandonment created the exact psychological and physical void his enemies required. Marco approached him then, his heavy footsteps masked by the sterile hum of the ward. "Security is doubled," Marco reported, his voice tight with an unfamiliar anxiety. "Inner perimeters, outer zones, even the medical staff were locked under absolute surveillance. Control, once lost, is desperately, obsessively reclaimed. No one enters without being cleared 3 separate times, Marco assured him, yet Dante never broke his gaze from the fragile figure behind the glass. They already got close once, Dante replied, his tone devoid of heat but saturated with a terrifying, absolute certainty. That means they had help. Neither man wasted breath on denial. In behavioral analysis, we call this the insider threat paradigm. The Russo syndicate did not rely on brute force. They meticulously mapped Dante's organization and exploited a weak link. Someone had handed them the precise intelligence needed to isolate Alina and slowly erase her without triggering the defense mechanisms. The bitter truth we must all face is that the deepest wounds are never inflicted by strangers. They come from within our own walls. Marco voiced the inevitable reality, noting they would certainly make another attempt. Dante slightly shifted his posture, the apex predator, anticipating the hunt. No, Dante corrected him. They will expect her to die here. This distinction is critical in psychological warfare. Expectations breed predictable patterns, and predictable patterns can be violently broken. Suddenly, a minuscule stutter in the rhythm of the heart monitor commanded their attention. A nurse moved into the sterile room, manipulating the intravenous line with practiced efficiency. But Dante's hyper-vigilant mind caught the anomaly. He saw the microscopic hesitation, the rapid eye dart toward the exit, the rigid tension in her spine. It reminds us that guilt always leaves a fingerprint on the physical body. The anomaly's less than a second, yet it was all the empirical data Dante required. His predatory instincts engaged instantly. "Who is she?" he demanded. Never once turning his head, Marco tracked his line of sight, analyzing the subject. "New rotation," Marco replied softly. Brought in with the emergency shift, fully cleared through hospital administration. Dante's facial muscles remained frozen, yet the atmospheric pressure around him seemed to plummet. "Bring me her file," he ordered. Marco retreated immediately, initiating a cascade of silent commands to men programmed to obey without ethical hesitation. Inside the glass cage, the nurse concluded her task. Dante remained completely motionless, his clinical focus dissecting the minute. Behavioral tells that ordinary people miss. Let us look closely at her behavioral leakage. Her fingers had hovered over the medical tubing just a fraction of a second too long. She consciously avoided making direct visual contact with her incapacitated victim. Furthermore, her physical trajectory toward the exit leaned unnaturally toward the door, indicating a subconscious drive to flee. In Dante's unforgiving ecosystem, these microscopic deviations were a confession. Time stretched into an agonizing silence until Marco returned. The enforcer's face was now a mask of cold hostility. "There is no record," Marco whispered. "She does not exist in the administrative system." Dante finally rotated his body. His eyes were no longer those of a mourning ex-husband. They were the empty, lethal eyes of a man who has already decided to kill. "Then she should not be in my hospital," Dante concluded, issuing a final judgment devoid of any moral conflict. Inside the intensive care unit, the imposter reached the handle. Time seemed to warp, compressing the impending violence into a single, unbearable heartbeat. "Stop her," Dante commanded. The order was not shouted. True authority never requires volume. Marco was already in motion before the final syllable left Dante's lips. The heavy door was thrust open as 2 armed operatives materialized, sealing off every tactical exit with terrifying precision. The nurse froze, her synthetic calm fracturing instantly, revealing the sheer primal terror hiding beneath. The lesson is inescapable. We can wear the most elaborate masks, but reality always shatters the illusions we try to project. Let us open this file and examine the behavioral patterns together. What we observe in the assassin is not a fear of authority, but a profound psychological terror of failure. Her eyes darted toward Alina, then the intravenous line, providing Dante all the empirical data he required. "Don't touch anything," he commanded. "Notice how a true megalomaniacal narcissist like Dante occupies a room. His sheer dominance alters the environmental baseline. The rhythmic chiming of the medical equipment felt unnaturally amplified. This was premeditated elimination, not negligence." The operative tried to speak, but her defensive mechanisms completely collapsed the second Dante initiated direct eye contact. "Who sent you?" he asked. His tone was flat, carrying a psychological weight designed to crush any fabricated narrative before it could even form. Silence was her only verbal response. However, her micro-expressions betrayed her. For a fraction of a second, an involuntary flash of recognition surfaced in her pupils, not directed at him, but at the unseen architect of this plot. In clinical terms, Dante experienced a cognitive pivot. He understood this was a systemic breach, not a localized attack on his dependent, Alina. For an apex predator, realization never manifests as panic. It presents as a cold, immediate calculation. It threaded through his prefrontal cortex with the terrifying clarity of a subject who uses aggression to mask underlying paranoia. The hospital was no longer a controlled environment. The perimeter he constructed had failed from the inside out, turning every medical uniform and sterile corridor into an active variable that could no longer be trusted. He advanced into the space without a single micro-hesitation. His psychological projection was so absolute that the surrounding guards instantly adapted, sealing the perimeter with the synchronized discipline of a pack responding to their alpha. On the bed, Alina remained entirely motionless. She was completely ignorant of how the fragile boundary between survival and termination had just been manipulated by hands mimicking empathy. The operative attempted another vocalization, but her neurological composure fractured under Dante's unrelenting stare. You can clearly observe the breakdown of her conditioning here. This subject was highly trained, systematically inserted through multiple security checkpoints by deliberate design. She was a weapon, and as Marco stepped closer, the tension in the room escalated into something highly volatile. Marco's facial effect flattened, perfectly mirroring the sociopathic realization of his superior. Without requiring a verbal directive, he initiated a total quarantine of the internal digital network, severing any external access points. Beyond the intensive care unit, there were no auditory alarms, only a silent structural shift in power dynamics. Dante's cognitive processing was a study in ruthless efficiency. His eyes traced the intravenous tube, the cardiac monitor, and finally the operative, reverse engineering the timeline of the attempted murder. Stick with me, this is where the pathology gets fascinating. He deduced that the lethal compound had not reached its intended saturation point, or that an external variable had disrupted the biological timing. He was deconstructing her method without a single drop of empathy. To a mind like his, the specifics were irrelevant. The salient data point was that a rival entity had mapped this vulnerability down to the literal second. They hypothesized that Alina would expire without resistance, isolated from her protector, but they failed to account for Dante's obsessive control. "Clear the line," he ordered. His vocal frequency never spiked, yet it conveyed an absolute, lethal authority. A subordinate immediately summoned a physician vetted through private, rather than institutional networks. Notice the physiological response of our captive. Her respiratory rate became shallow and erratic. The autonomic nervous system does not lie. Dante observed this shift with clinical detachment, watching the exact psychological moment her professional certainty collapsed, and primitive biological terror took complete command. Interestingly, you and I can see this was not just a fear of physical pain, but the terror of failing her own handlers. "Who gave you access?" Dante repeated. The acoustic properties of his voice remained utterly flat. This was no longer a simple interrogation. It was a psychological vice, deliberately constricting her mental escape routes. Her silence was a highly active state, a rapid internal calculus, weighing the consequences of betrayal against the certainty of Dante's retaliation. That microscopic hesitation provided him with the necessary diagnostic criteria. This operative belonged to a complex organizational structure, not an isolated delusion. Marco approached with a digital device, his demeanor urgent but highly regulated. He handed over the data extracted before the network blackout, offering the next critical piece of the puzzle. The data revealed a rigid behavioral pattern. 3 fictional subjects on the same floor, utilizing identical forged credentials, all left clinically unattended within a 2-hour window. Dante absorbed this data matrix instantaneously. This was a synchronized purge, a systematic eradication of human liabilities and witnesses tethered to his criminal network. It is crucial to understand how sociopaths view territory. The hospital had been forcibly converted from a sanctuary of healing into an industrial slaughterhouse. Dante inquired about the other medical staff, his mind already anticipating the vacuum. Marco confirmed they were entirely absent. No digital footprints, no visual records. They had evaporated. It was a masterful display of ghosting, leaving behind only the psychological residue of an invisible, highly capable adversary. Dante refocused his attention on the captive. Her sustained silence operated as a far more dangerous metric than a frantic confession. This level of operational precision indicated an adversary who had perfectly profiled Dante's behavioral tendencies, reaction times, and territorial dominance. Such profound confidence rarely originates from a stranger. It is the hallmark of an intimate enemy, someone who understands the architecture of his paranoia. The vetted physician entered, displaying elevated arousal but maintaining fine motor control. He began flushing the intravenous system, aggressively reversing the chemical trauma. Dante remained physically passive but cognitively hyperactive. He catalogued every single clinical adjustment, his brain functioning as an infallible surveillance device, ensuring his absolute control was restored. Let us pause and analyze this critical juncture. Alina's biometrics stabilized. Her underlying trauma bond, that profound, almost Stockholm-like dependency on her environment, manifested as a biological refusal to expire. Then, the operative finally vocalized. "You're too late," she whispered. Notice Dante's delayed physical response. A common thug reacts to provocation, but a megalomaniac absorbs the psychological data first. He allowed the statement to breathe, isolating its hidden variables. When he finally rotated to face her, his affect had dropped below absolute zero. It was pure, unadulterated intent. "Not yet," he replied softly. Yet, simultaneously, Marco's physiological baseline shifted. It was an involuntary muscular response, the kind an organism displays only when a new, immediate threat completely overrides the current baseline. Marco's nonverbal cues indicated sensory input arriving faster than his verbal processing could handle. Dante, hyper-attuned to the emotional states of his subordinates, required no explanation. The pathology of this attack was still actively spreading. The shift in the environment manifested as an oppressive vacuum, a heavy, unnatural stillness that forces a rigidly controlled mind to acknowledge a loss of dominance. Dante perceived this structural collapse seconds before Marco's device indicated a secure communication. Outside, the tactical formation of his enforcers mutated from a defensive posture into one of aggressive containment. This is the exact moment an illusion of safety shatters. The operative's cryptic diagnostic that he was already too late hung in the sterile air, acting as a grim diagnostic of his deeply flawed psychological armor. For the first time during this crisis, Dante's cognitive model recognized that containment had failed. He was no longer preventing an event. He was reacting to an active, expanding contagion. Marco closed the physical distance, his voice suppressed but saturated with survival urgency. "We've got movement," he reported, breaking eye contact to scan the perimeter before refocusing. A casualty had been discovered in the subterranean maintenance sector, deceased for over 60 minutes. Dante exhibited zero external distress, but internally his neurons rapidly recalibrated the temporal data. If the initial trauma occurred an hour prior, this operation predated the assassin's entry into Alina's suite. It predated the entire shift rotation. It was a masterclass in behavioral deception, executed right under the nose of a diagnosed control freak. This was not a mere perimeter violation. It was a parasitic operation, embedded so flawlessly into the hospital's daily rhythm that it became completely invisible to Dante's paranoid surveillance. He glanced at Alina, observing the fragile biological metrics anchoring her to reality, then immediately detached his empathy. The structural threat below demanded his absolute psychological focus. You and I must remember a vital life lesson here. Absolute control is often just an illusion we stubbornly maintain until a much smarter predator arrives. "Seal the upper floor," Dante commanded. His frequency was calm, completely devoid of panic, radiating the pure sociopathic authority of a strategist reclaiming the board. No departures, no entries. Any anomaly would be violently corrected. Marco simply nodded, translating that cold intent into immediate action. "Let us open this case file together. You and I are going to observe a fascinating behavioral shift. Notice the guards, their autonomic nervous systems reacted before their conscious minds did, a classic hyper-vigilant response." Dante stepped away from Alina's bed, severing the immediate emotional tether. As a megalomaniacal narcissist, his brain categorized her breathing not as a miracle, but as a baseline metric of his own successful control. Descending into the subterranean levels, the environmental stimuli shifted. The sterile, predictable upper floors vanished, replaced by a cold, mechanical labyrinth. The lighting flickered in specific intervals. To a standard brain, a mere malfunction. To a hypervigilant sociopath like Dante, it was a deliberate sensory disruption. The psychological warfare here is exquisitely calibrated. The perpetrator deliberately manipulated the environment to induce cognitive hesitation. They discovered the body precisely where Marco indicated. Positioned by a service door, forced open with surgical precision, the uniform and identification remained pristine. The methodology is what we in behavioral analysis call a signature of silent efficiency. There were no defensive wounds, indicating the victim's threat detection systems were completely bypassed. Dante crouched beside the corpse, his eyes scanning the scene. He was not looking at a dead man. He He was clinically decoding the attacker's mental state, reading the subtle implications of a predator who preferred psychological dominance over brute force. The corridor branched into the hospital's central nervous system, oxygen lines, electrical grids, backup generators. This was no longer a simple hostage dynamic. Dante murmured that the assassins were not there to merely terminate Alina. Marco understood the behavioral trap immediately, noting they were here to force a choice. Dante's cognitive processing sharpened. On the upper floor lay Alina, entirely fragile, kept alive by machines. Below lay the vulnerability of the entire infrastructure. The psychological pressure was designed to fracture Dante's compartmentalization. It is a terrifying reality we see in criminal psychology. When an adversary bypasses your physical armor, they aim directly to shatter your emotional core, making every innocent life collateral damage. Somewhere in that psychological space stood an unseen architect, forcing Dante into a classic double-bind scenario, a sadistic test of his megalomaniacal narcissism. A faint noise echoed from the depths of the corridor, masked by the hum of the building. Dante's auditory processing isolated it instantly. It was not footsteps. It was the mechanical rhythm of a timer. His facial muscles remained paralyzed in stoic control, yet the atmospheric tension spiked. This was no longer a predatory hunt. It was a severe temporal crisis. He issued a sharp command to locate the source. His subordinates scattered immediately, mapping the auditory cues through a maze explicitly engineered to trigger spatial disorientation and cognitive overload. Dante tracked the sound with a frighteningly controlled heart rate, his sociopathic focus mapping the worst-case scenarios. Fire suppression grids, oxygen tanks, any system could be weaponized. The auditory stimulus amplified until it brought them to a sealed electrical panel. Marco tore it open, and for a fraction of a second, the collective adrenaline of the group flatlined. It was not an explosive. In behavioral terms, it was something far more malicious. A compact device had been spliced into the life support matrix. Its illuminated screen displayed thousands of command lines, syncing like a parasite with the building's vital functions. It was not a countdown to physical destruction, but a calculated execution of systemic organ failure. You and I must look closely at this exact moment of realization. Dante approached, processing the complex data streams. This parasite was not programmed to detonate. It was engineered to initiate a slow, agonizing systemic collapse, patient by patient, beginning in the intensive care unit. Beginning with Alina, the psychological intent became brutally apparent. This was not a physical assault. It was a behavioral experiment. The unseen antagonist was observing Dante, waiting to see which life his narcissistic ego would prioritize. The realization did not manifest as panic, but as a suffocating inevitability. Dante recognized that the ultimate goal was never destruction, but absolute psychological exposure, stripping away his carefully constructed mask of control. His entire identity was built on the megalomaniacal illusion that he could wield absolute power without suffering human consequence. The device hummed quietly within its metal casing, a far greater psychological terror than any bomb. The cascading code revealed a creator who viewed the hospital not as steel and wire, but as a living, breathing organism. This adversary did not desire chaotic violence. They craved calculated despair, measured in the fading heartbeats within the intensive care unit. They wanted Dante to possess just enough time to cognitively process the exact magnitude of his loss. Then, Marco's voice severed the heavy silence. His tone was rigidly suppressed, though a micro-expression of profound dark anxiety leaked through his words. Marco suggested a manual shutdown, yet the subtle tremor in his vocal cords betrayed his fear of a catastrophic fail-safe trigger, a total system crash with zero backup. Dante did not offer an immediate verbal response. His ocular focus locked onto the terminal, analyzing the malignant code for the underlying psychological signature of its programmer. Beneath his clinical detachment, a deeply buried emotional response began to breach his defenses. This was an invasive disruption of his carefully maintained psychological distance. This incident transcended typical organized crime turf wars or strategic physical threats from a rival faction. The methodology was far too intimate, far too surgical, tearing into the very fabric of his behavioral safeguards. This attack was a psychological profiling masterpiece, weaponizing his own behavioral patterns and latent vulnerabilities against him. The nurse's subtle hesitation, the meticulously forged identities, Alina's sudden isolation, and the pregnancy Dante had been entirely unaware of. The statistical probability of coincidence was 0. Marco softly noted that the attacker wanted Dante to experience cognitive paralysis to make a fatal error in judgment. Dante's micro-expression shifted, validating Marco's assessment. Yet, the anticipated panic response never materialized. Instead, his psyche retreated into a chilling, sociopathic absolute. He stated clearly that they wanted a reaction. In behavioral strategy, reactions are predictable variables. True intention is not. He extended his hand, not to physically disarm the hardware, but to trace the neural pathways of the wires, mapping the parasite's limitations. In psychiatric terms, this trap was designed to induce tunnel vision, forcing a rash decision through the illusion of inescapable doom. But every psychological manipulation contains a fundamental flaw. Dante abruptly ordered his men to sever external access. Marco exhibited a brief moment of cognitive dissonance, confused by the command. Dante's hyper-focus sharpened as he explained the adversary's surveillance methodology. A total shutdown would result in an immediate loss of systemic control. However, by isolating the intrusion, Dante's supreme analytical mind finally locked onto the perfect countermeasure. By creating a closed loop, the predator would instantly become blind and powerless. Marco's synaptic pathways fired in agreement as he grasped the sheer brilliance of the tactic. Commands were executed with ruthless efficiency, outpacing the malicious software's internal clock. Dante's operatives functioned like white blood cells, severing the digital arteries and isolating the infected network. The entire facility seemed to hold its collective breath as the technological anatomy was reconfigured. The parasite continued to run its malignant code, completely unaware that it was now screaming into a void. Meanwhile, in the critical care unit above, Alina's cardiac monitors registered a brief anomaly before settling into a steady, reliable rhythm. Her biological stability was officially decoupled from the sadistic external stimuli that had nearly extinguished it. Dante registered this victory not through emotion, but through a visceral shift in the environmental tension. For the first time since the psychological assault began, his baseline stress hormones stabilized. It was not true relief, merely the suspension of immediate grief. Marco stated quietly that they could now safely terminate the program. Dante offered a single, authoritative nod. The execution command was flawless. The parasite collapsed upon itself, its threatening algorithms degrading into harmless, inert data. The resulting silence in the room fundamentally shifted. It was no longer the heavy silence of a trap, but the sterile quiet of an autopsy. We must pause here because this is where the true life lesson emerges. Those who seek to control everything are often the most easily manipulated. Dante did not step back. His paranoid ideation remained active, his eyes dissecting the dead machine to understand the architect's true obsession. With deliberate, mechanical slowness, he retrieved his phone and accessed a hyper-secure encrypted frequency. He offered no verbal greeting. There was zero need for communication because the psychological payload had already been delivered. Staring back at him was a solitary sentence, devoid of any digital footprint or sender data. The words were a final, devastating mental strike from one apex predator to another. She was never the true target. When you analyze the cognitive processing of someone like Dante, you notice a fascinating clinical shift right here. The psychological manipulation of his adversary becomes undeniable. The hospital crisis, Elena, the pregnancy. They were simply a textbook diversion, a misdirection engineered by a highly organized psychopath. Dante shows acute affective flattening. His face is perfectly blank, but neurologically, his control mechanisms are fracturing as he realizes he left his actual vulnerability totally exposed. The attack was never designed to erase his history. It is a harsh truth we all eventually learn. We spend so much energy guarding what we already have that we leave our future completely defenseless. This operation was clinically designed to sever him from his own future. I have evaluated enough predators to recognize this exact pattern. They do not just want to hurt you, they want to dismantle your potential. Dante pivots with sudden kinetic energy, his voice dropping into a cold, authoritarian command. "Get me back upstairs," he orders. But his cognitive focus has already detached from Elena and the medical ward. He knows that past the perimeters he thought were secure, the true target is completely exposed. It is a sobering reminder that no matter how obsessively we try to control our environment, we can never shield everything we care about from the chaos of the world. The terrifying reality for Dante is that his psychological realization may have arrived far too late.